Well, thank you so much, Jo. That was absolutely fascinating. Just before I launch into the questions, I actually had a few reactions to myself. If they've spoken, turns out Huggins actually spoke six times at the Royal Institution between 1865 and 1892. You'll be unsurprised to know that the title of his first talk, which was on the 19th of May 1865, was "On the Physical and Chemical Constitution of the Fixed Stars and Nebulae." So yeah, that's exactly. And yeah, I've gone through the titles, and all of his other ones are all kind of on that similar theme. And as I say, all the way between 1865 and 1892. So it was obviously something he was working on for many years.
Well, I love that he did it all in his back garden
in Tulse Hill, which is near me as well.
Around the corner, I've been there to have a look. Actually, I think his house isn't there anymore. But yeah, it's just brilliant to think that such important work was just going on right there in someone's garden.
Yeah, and also I think what the sort of overarching theme that I kind of drew out from what you were saying, and it's something that often occurs to me with history of science talks when they're explained well, is this idea that everything that humans make ends up making us in a way that you mentioned that with the clockwork that we made these clockwork devices, but then they ended up influencing our view of how the universe works and how everything works, and I think the same obviously right through to your example of GPS that you mentioned right at the end there, that we make these technologies, but these technologies end up sort of making us and reshaping how we think, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll leap into the questions. They're all a bit all over the place because obviously people have been reacting at different times. So we'll go right back to the start. And Jim asked, could you explain a bit more fully about man and the earth? I can't quite understand how he's written the question, but it says thinking about man and the earth changing before the hunter-gatherers became farmers. So I mean, both that transition from kind of hunter-gathering into farming and also kind of what the knowledge was, I guess, at that time before we became civilized in a sense.
Yeah, but it's really difficult to kind of know exactly what was going on because we don't have those written records. So that's why it's kind of a patchwork between, you're trying to analyze the paintings, people are looking at myths, people are looking at hunter-gatherer communities, both from the recent past and from and people still living today. But everything does seem to revolve around the cosmos. So you have people living in Central America, for example, the Barasana people who their houses are sort of modeled on the sun's path through the cosmos, for example. So they're oriented sort of north, south, east, west. There's the sun's post. So their whole kind of way that they live, their houses, everything's a model of the cosmos, and everything is oriented within that. And this living sort of creatures in the sky also seems to be a real theme as well. So there's, there isn't they don't really distinguish between earth and sky, man and nature, as I said, and it's animals. And there's a lot of work that I didn't have time to mention as well on shamanism and on altered states of consciousness, and the theory that a lot of the paintings, for example, had to do with sort of spirit journeys, and people were exploring their cosmos sort of through these trances. So again, there wasn't the same distinction that we would make between the kind of rational physical world out there and what you're seeing in altered states of consciousness. They were sort of taking insights from both of those things. So just a much more holistic picture than we would have now.
Oh, it's interesting you talked about animals, actually, because Anand was asking a question about the zodiac symbols, which is that, and I've thought this as well when you look at astrology, some of them you're like, okay, Scorpio, like that definitely looks like a scorpion, that, okay, that's a bit of a bull, but some of them are really, really, just like a few dots and someone's gone, yeah, that's definitely a crab. So how are these symbols kind of accepted, or how did they kind of come about? And also I think people were also talking about maybe other zodiac cultures, such as the Hindu culture, for example.
Yeah, so they vary. Some are much more recent than others, and some kind of go right back. And we don't know, the bull of heaven, Taurus, we know it goes back at least as far as the Babylonians, but we don't know where they got it from before that. So it's one of the earliest constellations. So it could well be that it originates further back. And I think whether or not that story is true about the Lascaux cave, I think that's a very plausible story about the kind of way in which these associations would get made. So it's not it wouldn't be that people would just look up and go, oh, that looks a bit like a bull, let's call it a bull. But you'd have these more meaningful associations. So the Pleiades, for example, if the rising and setting of the Pleiades is kind of marking the mating season of the bull, which is important for people's lives because they hunt these animals, then you associate the Pleiades with a bull, and then the stars around it become built into that sort of bigger creature. So it's those kinds of connections. Really, it's actually, you know, they're including, or they're communicating kind of truths about how people related to the stars and the things that were important to them at the time, rather than someone just going, oh yeah, that looks like a bull. So yeah, I mean, I don't know the stories for all of the individual constellations, but I think that's a really kind of useful one to think about how these kinds of stories have kind of evolved and, you know, emerged and evolved through time.
And what's interesting, I think that mechanism of storytelling as the sort of knowledge transfer, you know, medium, if you like, sort of reminds me a bit of religions, right? How a lot of sort of religious origin stories and different sort of texts are sort of, you'll see similarities in some of the stories, and there'll be kind of similar themes or whatever. And then that sort of, can we say that that's kind of analogous to the fact that, say, in the Hindu zodiac system, they have sort of similar symbols? So were the Babylonians in contact with these people, or I guess they wouldn't really have had correspondence in the way that we think of in a sort of, you know, medieval sense or later?
There were definitely a lot of contacts and communications at this time. So the Babylonians, certainly with the Persians. So I didn't look so much at the Hindu culture, I think, which is absolutely fascinating. And they have a very strong tradition, of course, of sort of cosmological beliefs that sort of resonate with a lot of the themes that I'm looking at in the book. To narrow it down, what I tried to do in the book was specifically look at just 12 very particular moments in how we built this sort of Western scientific view, because that's so dominant. It was more, I wanted to kind of look at how did we get here, rather than trying to sort of summarize kind of every culture and what everyone has thought about the sky. But in religions, absolutely. And you see a lot of celestial beliefs kind of creeping into religion. So one of the chapters in the book, I look at the origins of Christianity and the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century AD, who was really the one that sort of took Christianity from being a kind of minor sect and made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that's really why it's become so influential today. And he, not just him, but he was particularly influential in incorporating a lot of beliefs from sort of pagan sun worship into Christianity, partly because it just made it much easier for people to kind of switch over. So, you know, it's a fairly obvious one that we celebrate Christmas just after the winter solstice. So, you know, just as the rebirth of the sun, as the days start getting longer again, and the timing of Easter as well, just after the spring equinox, there's, you know, worship on a Sunday rather than the previous of the Sabbath on, and then you've got, you know, the early Christians used to pray to the east towards the rising sun, for example. So you've got sort of all of these influences that kind of got snuck in. Even the halo that you see in Christian imagery, that's come from the sort of the rays of the sun that the Romans before that would show around the sun god, and Constantine liked to show himself with these rays. So yeah, all sorts of beliefs or symbols that we see now kind of have their origins in these celestial beliefs.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. We've had a request. I know it was really interesting hearing about Richard of Wallingford, who I shamefully didn't know so much about. But obviously, before all the water clocks and the sand clocks, we had sundials. So I don't know. So we've had a request of. Would you like to say anything about sundials and sort of how they've influenced our? I'm not sure if that's something you look at in the book or not.
I mean, it shows you how, you know, the very first methods of marking time, they were coming directly from the sky. So the sundials and then the star clocks at night. So sundials go, right back to the Babylonians as well. Most things, I think, go back to the Babylonians. There is a really nice poem written by a Roman, and he's complaining bitterly about these horrible sundials, and how they're splitting up his day into hours. And, you know, he's rushed now. He can't just do things when he wants. He's got to be ruled by the sundial. And it was just, I really like that, because, you know, it's just such a familiar sentiment, the way that we feel about clocks now, except he was worrying about just, you know, marking the hours. It just goes to show like that, those attempts to kind of measure the passing of time. It's not inevitable. We do know communities now that don't, as I said, but that did start like really, really early on.
Oh, absolutely. And just going back to what was I saying? To Richard of Wallingford as well. That now obviously time. What am I trying to say? That we have. That we kind of now thanks to, you know, the clockwork convention, we have everything kind of down to the minute, down to the second, and everything. Do we think that? I mean, Garth asked a question that now you're sort of saying the impacts of technology on, you know, GPS and light pollution and that sort of thing. But do we think this idea of time management might also be a pernicious one, that we have to measure time and we have to, you know, do this for 15 minutes, do this for 15 minutes, block out things, and actually. People never lived like that. We sort of grew up with a much more relaxed day, night, yearly kind of cycle, and didn't compartmentalize our time down to the minute and down to the second.
Yeah, I think it is quite an unnatural way to live, and there is quite a lot of research showing that that's actually adding to stress levels and this idea of time famine. So there's the kind of the stress of always being rushed, but then there's always also this perception of then not having enough time. It's like the more you pack in, the more, you know, the more tightly timed everything is. There's this feeling that was certainly familiar to me. I don't know about most people in the audience, of just feeling that there isn't enough time to do everything. And of course, you know, we should have more time than ever, right? You know, with all of the labor saving devices that we have. And that does, change how people live, and it stops them from, as I said, engaging in leisure activities, helping people negative way. I think it's linked to a lot of the work on mindfulness probably as well, that if you are watching the clock, worrying about time, are you late to get somewhere, or, you know, that's stopping you from just being in the moment and enjoying the experience of what you're doing, because you're just thinking about abstract numbers and counting and, oh, I need to rush. So, yeah, that is quite a sort of hot area in psychology at the moment.
Oh, we've had some great comments about some different civilizations' view of astronomy. Some people talk about Australian Aboriginal beliefs, which I don't know if you've gone into, because yours is more about sort of Western beliefs. But Jane was asking if you'd investigated any ancient Australian astronomy.
I didn't look at it in detail. I mean, the cave paintings is also quite an interesting area there, because there's a lot of really interesting cave art from Australia, and then as dating techniques get better, we'll hopefully get more information from that. And the main thing that I really love from the Aboriginal beliefs is the sort of the shadow pictures they see in the Milky Way. So they have sort of stories and characters and figures that they actually see not in the stars of the Milky Way, but in the dark patches. It's like the Milky Way is so bright that what stands out are the sort of the shapes of dark. And I just think that's really beautiful. And it also kind of brings home how bright, how amazing this site would have been. And we've just forgotten, I think, what it even used to be. I mean, I'm sure other people in the audience will know that if you ever do see a truly dark sky, you're suddenly like, wow, you know, you'd like, you know, we might go to the countryside and I'll take the kids and we'll say, oh, look, you know, guys, there's the stars, because you can't really see anything in London, and they'll look up and there'll be a few, and it'd be like, oh yes, we see the plough, but it's not the same as when, you know, so I think there is a danger that we're kind of forgetting what we've even lost.
And actually, on that question of light pollution, I'm just trying to find who asked the question now. It was Cameron, who said, you spoke about the deleterious effects of light pollution. Do you consider the Starlink satellites, for instance, to be light pollution as well? I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yes, I do. So these are like mini satellites that are being sent up by the 100. I'm not sure. I think eventually there's going to be tens of thousands of them to help with internet coverage around the planet, which is a really good thing to be sort of aiming for. But there is no regulation of this whatsoever. So it's kind of this I would say land grab, but it's it's up in space.
Space grab.
Companies just trying to kind of mark their territory, and so they're just sending up loads of these things without any thought for what that's going to do, and especially at sort of dawn and dusk, the sunlight can glint off them. And I think the worry is that there's going to be more of them than actual stars in the sky. So it's obliterating our natural view of the stars in a way that you can't even go somewhere dark, because these satellites are going to be seen everywhere. And it is a worry, I think, that there is nobody looking out for that, you don't need to get any permission. I think there's sort of, they regulate the different like bandwidths of for the communications, but in terms of what you're doing to the view of the sky, there's no regulations about that whatsoever. And astronomers have been speaking up about it a bit because they're worried about, their astronomical observations. But I think that this is also a huge thing for the rest of us. The stars are so important for our cultural heritage, and this is just being destroyed, and no one's even asked us about it. So, and there are things that can be done. I think you can sort of maybe paint the undersides of them black so that they don't reflect the light as much. Or, do we really need quite as many of these things? So yeah, that is something that I'm worried about.
And it's quite interesting, actually, just as I kind of notice the time, the time pressure that we're under, and start to bring things to a close. What was I going to say? I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. I'm so sorry. Anyway, yes. So I think it's interesting. So that's what I was going to say. I think it's interesting that you put it in terms of cultural heritage, because actually, because it's sort of not been a thing, like the sky hasn't just been switched off overnight, right? It's been something that gradually the light in cities has increased, and obviously the Starlink satellites and so forth. But in a way, being able to see the stars, to see the Milky Way, to see the Plough, to see these things, like you say, that have influenced us and been a force in human culture for millennia, is almost like not being able to see the Parthenon, or not being able to see, the Altus of the Elgin marbles, but but you know what I mean, to see these kind of cultural treasures, to be able to see the pyramids, for example. But these stars
there's something that every human culture in history has looked up at and told stories and navigated by these stars and got, worshipped these stars, been inspired by these stars. And we're the first people not to have that. So yeah, you could compare that to sort of these sort of cultural treasures, or you could compare it as just part of the natural world. If suddenly we were no longer ever going to be able to see the sea ever again, I kind of think people would be sort of up in arms about that. But with the stars, it just doesn't seem. I mean, there are obviously some dark sky campaigns, but it's not a sort of major issue. And I'm not really sure why that is. But I think it should be. I think it's as bad as if we were suddenly no longer able to see forests or no longer able to see the ocean.
Well, it's a very stark message to leave us with. Thank you so much, Jo. Just before I finally say goodbye to everyone, just a few quick reminders. So you know, anyone's welcome to join the Royal Institution as a member or a patron. There's no nomination, there's no qualification. You just need to like science and want to support us. So please do check out our website. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the talk, please do give us a donation. There's been links popping up in the chat, so do click that and send us a donation. It'll help keep us going for a little bit longer. Jo's book, The Human Cosmos, has been out for a little while now, but you'll be able to a couple of months. You'll be able to find it in all good bookshops. So do please support your local bookshop if at all possible. But we have also got links to giant multinational corporations popping up in the chat for your convenience too. Jo, is there anything else? Obviously, you've got this book, you've got Cure, and you've got the Antikythera mechanism book. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, or any other things you'd like people to know about you before we go?
Not really. If anybody wants more information, they can go to my website. That's jomarchant.com, and that's got information about all of my books and articles that I've written and other interviews.
And they all come very highly recommended.
So thank you. Thanks for having me.
So thank you so much, Jo, and thanks to everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Take care. Good night.